April 22, 1945, deep beneath bomb-shattered Berlin, Hitler erupts, screaming, "The war is lost! Everything is lost!" For the first time, the dictator who pledged victory admits defeat to his stunned generals and Goebbels. This is the moment when Hitler realized the war was lost, an admission that doomed millions and sealed Europe's fate. But the seeds of collapse had been planted years earlier. How did invincibility unravel into total despair? The answer starts on a frozen road outside Moscow. December 1941 brought the German army to a standstill just outside Moscow. The advance that began with such speed in June now faced a wall of ice and steel. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid, rifles jammed, and supply trucks stalled by the hundreds along endless, snow-choked roads. Soldiers wrapped themselves in scavenged rags, burning fence posts and even furniture to keep frostbite at bay. The Wehrmacht's summer uniforms offered no protection against the Russian winter. Ammunition and food ran low. Horses, meant to haul artillery, collapsed in the snow. Inside Army headquarters, the mood shifted from confidence to anxiety. Chief of Staff Franz Halder filled his diary with terse entries. On December 5th, he wrote of the utter exhaustion of the troops and the impossibility of further attack. Soviet forces, once believed shattered, now launched fierce counteroffensives. Red Army divisions pushed the Germans back from the capital. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility cracked. Hitler refused to accept the new reality. When generals pleaded for tactical withdrawals to save their men, he responded with fury. On December 19th, he dismissed Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch for suggesting retreat. Others, including Guderian and Höppner, faced similar threats or outright removal. Orders from the top demanded that every inch of ground be held, regardless of cost. The High Command watched as entire divisions vanished in the snow. Logistics failures haunted every decision. The original plan for Operation Barbarossa had gambled on a quick Soviet collapse. No one had prepared for a winter campaign hundreds of miles from the German border. Trains carrying fuel and food could not keep up. Medical units reported thousands of frostbite cases each week. The Army's supply system, stretched to the breaking point, began to unravel. Halder's notes from late December reveal a new tone. He describes Hitler's nervousness and growing impatience, but also moments of silence and brooding. Guderian, after being relieved of command, later recalled that the Führer's certainty had faltered. Yet, outwardly, Hitler doubled down, blaming his generals for defeatism and insisting that victory was still possible if only his orders were followed. The halt before Moscow shattered any illusion of an unstoppable German war machine. Frozen fields littered with abandoned equipment and the bodies of exhausted soldiers told a different story. The first seeds of doubt had taken root, not just among the generals, but in Hitler's own mind. The war he launched with absolute faith in victory was already slipping beyond his control. On November 22, 1942, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive pincer attack around Stalingrad. Within days, nearly 300,000 German soldiers, infantrymen, tank crews, supply staff, and their Romanian allies were trapped in a tightening ring of steel and snow. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, radioed for permission to break out west. The answer from Hitler's headquarters was blunt: stand fast, no retreat. Hitler insisted the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled troops by air. Hermann Göring, eager to please, promised daily deliveries of 700 tons. But the battered Ju-52 transport planes managed only a fraction of that. On most days, less than 80 tons reached the pocket. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies ran out. Wounded men lay freezing in makeshift shelters, waiting for help that never came. Paulus's officers sent increasingly desperate messages. Soviet artillery pounded the shrinking perimeter. By December, the German High Command knew the airlift was failing, but Hitler refused to accept it. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a title no German officer had ever surrendered with, an unspoken order to die rather than capitulate. Paulus stayed silent. On February 2, 1943, he gave up the fight. The last radio message from Stalingrad reported only chaos and silence. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the atmosphere turned funereal. Witnesses described Hitler as withdrawn, slumped in his chair, staring at the wall. He ate alone, spoke in clipped sentences, and raged at his generals behind closed doors. Heinz Guderian later wrote, "From that day, he knew the war could no longer be won." The surrender at Stalingrad was not just a military catastrophe. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and left the Nazi leadership reeling. Hitler's trust in his generals collapsed. He blamed them for cowardice and betrayal, even as his own orders had sealed the army's fate. From this point, Hitler's confidence never fully recovered. He began to retreat into suspicion and isolation, convinced that only his personal will could save Germany. But the reality, laid bare in the ruins of Stalingrad, could not be undone. The loss was irreversible, and the road ahead led only to further disaster. The surrender at Stalingrad left scars that ran deep through Hitler's command. In the months that followed, the trust between Hitler and his generals withered away. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most respected strategists, found himself increasingly sidelined. Hitler no longer saw his generals as partners, but as obstacles, doubters, even traitors. Orders from the Wolf's Lair grew more rigid. Withdrawal, even in the face of disaster, was forbidden. Every division was expected to fight to the last man, regardless of the cost or the reality on the ground. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 revealed just how far this command fracture had gone. Hitler insisted on launching Operation Citadel, a massive assault against deeply fortified Soviet positions. Senior officers, including Manstein, warned that the Soviets had prepared formidable defenses, mines, anti-tank ditches, and thousands of guns. But Hitler brushed aside these warnings, convinced that a decisive blow would turn the tide. The attack stalled within days. German panzer divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, were battered and forced onto the defensive. The Red Army seized the initiative for good. After Kursk, Hitler's interference only intensified. He dictated the movement of individual battalions from afar, often ignoring the advice of his field commanders. Reports from the front were filtered by loyal aides, and generals who questioned his orders risked dismissal, or worse. Manstein, who had salvaged retreats in earlier campaigns, was dismissed in March 1944 after clashing with Hitler over the need for flexible defense. In his memoirs, Manstein later described a leader obsessed with control, unwilling to delegate, and increasingly out of touch with the realities of modern warfare. As defeats mounted, Hitler clung to the idea of miracle weapons. He spoke endlessly of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, jet fighters, and new tanks that would supposedly reverse Germany's fortunes. Factories raced to produce these machines, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. The generals, watching their armies shrink and their requests ignored, saw these promises as fantasy. With each passing month, the gulf between Hitler's orders and the battlefield grew wider. The Wehrmacht, once a model of coordinated command, now moved at the whim of a single man, one who trusted no one but himself. June 6, 1944, Allied troops storm ashore in Normandy, opening a new front that Germany can't hope to seal. Paratroopers drop behind the lines, tanks roll off landing craft, and by nightfall, the beaches are held. The Western Front is back, and Hitler is forced to split his dwindling forces. 2 weeks later, a second disaster hits. On June 22nd, the Red Army launches Operation Bagration. 4 Soviet fronts smash through Army Group Center in Belarus. German lines collapse in days. By July, over 500,000 German soldiers are dead, wounded, or missing. Villages burn, columns of prisoners march east, and the Eastern Front falls apart. The Wehrmacht is now fighting for survival on both sides of Europe. Inside Hitler's headquarters, The mood turns grim. Reports pile up, lost divisions, shattered airfields, bridges blown behind retreating troops. Hitler stops talking about victory. His speeches fill with words like sacrifice, honor, and vengeance. He pins his hopes on new weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket. These so-called miracle weapons hit London and Antwerp, but they can't slow the Allied advance or change the war's direction. Generals grumble in private, calling the rockets a distraction from real strategy. Desperation breeds suspicion. On July 20th, 1944, a briefcase bomb explodes at the Wolf's Lair. Hitler survives with minor injuries, but the attack shatters what's left of his trust. He orders a sweeping purge. More than 4,900 people are executed or imprisoned. Officers, bureaucrats, even old friends. Interrogations run day and night. The circle around Hitler grows smaller and more fearful. Decision-making tightens to a handful of loyalists. Information is filtered, dissent is crushed, and paranoia spreads through every level of command. With the front lines crumbling and conspirators hunted, Hitler turns inward. He issues orders from a shrinking bunker world, convinced that betrayal, not defeat, is his real enemy. The Reich is now surrounded, battered from the outside and hollowed out from within. The dream of victory has vanished, replaced by a grim determination to drag the war out as long as possible, no matter the cost. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West. Tanks and infantry surged through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies and seize Antwerp. The gamble depended on surprise and speed, but the plan faltered almost immediately. American forces, battered but unbroken, held key crossroads at Bastogne and St. Vith. Winter storms grounded the Luftwaffe, and fuel shortages stranded German panzers in snow-covered forests. By January, the Allies had regrouped, pushing the Germans back across the same ground they had gained at such cost. The toll was staggering. The Wehrmacht lost nearly 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Most of its remaining tanks and aircraft were destroyed. The last reserves, scraped from training camps and convalescent hospitals, vanished in the Ardennes. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overseeing the front, told his staff quietly, "This is the end." There would be no more grand offensives. From now on, Germany could only defend, and even that was slipping out of reach. The defeat in the Ardennes left the Western Front wide open, signaling that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt, even for those at the highest levels of command. In January 1945, Hitler withdrew to the bunker beneath Berlin's shattered chancellery. News from the front grew worse by the hour. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River just 50 miles from the city. Soviet artillery thundered in the distance, but inside the bunker, Hitler clung to maps and fantasies. He issued orders for counterattacks by divisions that existed only on paper, phantom armies, names without men or weapons. Staff officers drafted elaborate plans for offensives that no one expected to materialize. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and one of the last confidants allowed regular access, later wrote, "Hitler no longer governed. He simply waited for the end." Meetings became ritual. Hitler stared at situation maps, his trembling hand tracing lines across territory already lost. He pored over reports of reinforcements that would never arrive. When generals spoke of reality, of ammunition shortages, of collapsed defenses, he dismissed them with silence or sudden rage. The outside world shrank to a warren of concrete rooms. Hitler rarely emerged, even as Berlin's streets filled with refugees and the wounded. The bunker became both fortress and prison. As the Soviets closed in, Hitler's orders grew more detached from the facts on the ground. His war was now fought in whispers and shadows, with armies that existed only in his imagination. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet Union unleashed its final blow against Berlin. More than 2.5 million Red Army soldiers pressed forward, backed by 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces. The thunder of guns never stopped. Whole neighborhoods vanished beneath the shells. Soviet infantry advanced street by street, block by block, as flames and smoke choked the city. German defenders, old men, teenage boys, wounded soldiers on crutches, manned barricades and shattered buildings. Ammunition ran low, food was scarce. The city's hospitals overflowed with the wounded and dying. Inside the bunker, maps showed the Soviet pincers tightening from every direction. Reports arrived by the hour. The outer defenses had collapsed. The enemy was inside the city limits. Bridges and rail lines were gone. Yet Hitler refused evacuation. He ordered his staff to remain at their posts. When pressed to flee to the so-called Alpine Redoubt, he snapped, "I will not abandon Berlin. The capital must be defended to the last man." With every passing day, the circle shrank. Escape routes closed one by one. Communications failed. The thunder of Soviet artillery shook the bunker walls. Above ground, the city crumbled. Below, Hitler clung to the fantasy of relief armies that no longer existed. The end was no longer a distant threat. It pressed in from every side, inescapable and absolute. On April 22, 1945, Hitler's outburst in the Fuhrer bunker, witnessed by Keitel, Jodl, and Goebbels, marked the first time he admitted defeat, declaring, "The war is lost." This moment was the culmination of years of mounting disasters: the defeat at Stalingrad, the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, and the destruction of Army Group Center. Official records show Hitler's faith in his generals collapsed after Stalingrad, leading to increased paranoia and the execution of nearly 5,000 suspected conspirators. Yet, much about his private deliberations in the final days remains unknown. Some documents are still classified or lost. The evidence shows that absolute power and denial of reality drove Germany toward ruin, with Hitler's isolation in the bunker ending in suicide on April 30, 1945. The legacy of these events remains a warning. Unchecked authority and disregard for fact can have catastrophic consequences.